The Western style diet that most of us eat, which is high in red meat and saturated fats, is definitely bad for brain health. It's much better if people want to look to how to eat, they should look at the current Canadian food guide.
Hello, I am Celia Sanka, Executive Director of the DiversityCanada Foundation, the organization that brings you GoldenVoices.com. Golden Voices is the online portal where seniors gather to focus on issues of importance to seniors. And at GoldenVoices.com you will find our Golden Years Fireside Chat series, a series where we meet with experts and everyday seniors to speak about topics under the theme of living longer and living well. Today we will be focusing in this episode on dementia. That's a topic that has become more and more important over the years as dementia is experienced by more and more seniors. But is it something that's inevitable? Or are there things that we can do to ensure that dementia is not part of our experience of later life, or to push it further and further down the road? Well, that's precisely what we will be speaking about with Dr. Nicole Anderson, Professor of Psychology with the University of Toronto. Dr. Anderson is a registered clinical neuropsychologist who obtained an AB in psychology from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and an MA and a PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto. She is a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute and director of the Ben and Hilda Katz Interprofessional Research Program in Geriatric and Dementia Care at Baycrest. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Gerontological Society of America, and was the associate editor of the Journal of Gerontology, Psychological Sciences from 2014 to 2019. Her research focuses on how memory processes are affected by healthy aging and mild cognitive impairment, as well as on cognitive and lifestyle interventions to promote health and reduce dementia risk. So we're quite privileged to be speaking with Dr. Anderson today.
So we'll go right into a discussion on dementia and how we can reduce the risk of dementia so that we can enjoy long and healthy lives and fully with as much of our capacity as possible. So if we were to start with a definition of dementia, what exactly is dementia?
Yeah, so you can think of dementia as the symptoms of different brain diseases. So dementia refers to the decline in cognitive functioning. So things like memory and problem solving, sometimes language abilities, that is significant enough to interfere with day-to-day life. So dementia refers to the cognitive and other behavioral symptoms of various brain diseases.
Right, so dementia is not in and of itself a disease.
Correct. It's the consequences of a disease, yeah.
And is dementia a given? Is dementia the normal passage in life that we should all expect as we age?
Absolutely not. It's definitely the exception. The vast majority of older adults will live out their lives in good cognitive health.
So dementia is the result of various conditions, various diseases. What then are the diseases that bring about dementia?
There are a lot of them. There's at least 14 known diseases that cause dementia, but there are some that are a lot more common than others. So everybody's heard of Alzheimer's disease. That's the most common form of a disease that causes dementia. So we all know about Alzheimer's disease. It's associated with these plaques and tangles in the brain that impair brain function. Other common ones are vascular dementia. which is the result of tiny strokes in the brain. So a lot of people have heard of TIAs or mini strokes. TIA stands for transient ischemic attack, which is a very funny word, I find. It's kind of like a B-rated movie, but that means transient is that they're very brief, not long-lived mini strokes. Ischemic just refers to blood vessels in the brain, and the attack, I guess, is because it's attacking the brain. It's very common for people to have TIAs, so I don't want to get anybody anxious about this. About a quarter of us will have at least one TIA in our lifetime. And usually they don't really have any consequences long term. People recover from them quite well. But the problem is when people have too many of them over a prolonged period of time, their effects can gradually accumulate and affect the brain and cause symptoms very similar to what we see in Alzheimer's disease. And it's also important to note that it's very rare for somebody to have a pure form of dementia, to have, say, only Alzheimer's disease. A lot of people have mixed dementias, so Alzheimer's and a bit of vascular dementia or some other form too. Other common forms of dementia are frontal lobe dementia, which can actually affect either the frontal lobes and cause behavioral disturbances, or it can affect the temporal lobes and cause language impairments. And then finally, in some cases, people with Parkinson's can develop a Parkinson's dementia and have cognitive impairments after years of having Parkinson's symptoms. There are a lot of other forms as well, but they're less common, so I won't go into the details of all of them.
So you say that dementia is not the norm. It's not what we should all expect, but it is actually a growing problem. What do the statistics look like?
The statistics are pretty grim if we don't do anything about it. So the prevalence, or the number of people living with dementia, is doubling about every 20 years. So in 2015, there were about 47 million people worldwide living with dementia. And by 2050, that's supposed to be about 131 million people worldwide living with dementia. And the reason why it's going up is just because the population is growing and the population is aging. We had the big baby boomer bulge post-World War II, and those people are reaching their older ages. So it's just a function of there being more older adults on the planet now, which is why the numbers are going up. And they're going up more in low and middle income countries than in first world countries too, where actually the incidence, or the number of people each year who develop dementia, is actually starting to decline a little bit because of our better health care, and staying in better heart health helps to reduce the risk and things like that too.
That's pretty interesting. And good news that there seems to be some progress in the developed world to ensuring that we're having some sort of control over what eventually happens in later life with our seniors. And that's something I want to look at, how much control there is. Now, there are risk factors for dementia, and if I understand correctly, some we can have control over, and others we have absolutely no control over because of various reasons. If we look at the first type, what are some risk factors that perhaps no one can, have control over, and they will always be present with us?
Right. So the risk factors that are out of our control are first age. Just the older we get, the more likely we are to develop dementia, and we obviously can't do anything about getting older. Another one is genetics. Almost all forms of dementia do have a genetic component to them. So, for example, for Alzheimer's disease, if people have a close relative, had a parent or a sibling who had Alzheimer's, then their risk is higher than somebody with no family history, because there is a number of genes, but one in particular, the ApoE gene, that does increase risk if you have a certain type of it. And then finally, sex is a risk factor. So, and it differs depending on the type of dementia. So, for Alzheimer's disease, more women than men develop Alzheimer's disease. And we don't still really understand why, but it probably has something to do with estrogen and the loss of estrogen with menopause. But for Parkinson's-related dementia, the majority of people with Parkinson's-related dementia are men. And again, we don't really understand why. So those are the three big ones that we can't do anything about. So getting older, our sex, and our genetics.
The first one, there isn't a magic potion that we can drink to prevent aging, to give us an internal youth. The science hasn't come up with that yet.
No.
Okay. So what about other factors, risk factors that we can control? What are some of those? And afterwards, we can look more closely at how we can control them.
Right, right. So there was an important paper that came out last year in Lancet Neurology that identified a number of factors that help to reduce dementia risk. And cumulatively, they show that they can reduce dementia risk by 40%, which is pretty phenomenal. And these start in our early lives. So the amount of formal education that we obtain, the more we get, the lower our dementia risk. If we can avoid having head injuries, that reduces our risk. If we can stay socially active, if we can stay physically active, if we can keep health conditions under control that negatively affect brain health, so things like hypertension, diabetes, things like that, that helps to reduce our risk as well. And what they didn't include is a host of other factors, because the evidence is just not quite there yet. But I suspect that over the years, they'll add things like eating a healthy diet and staying cognitively engaged throughout life, things like that. So I bet that the actual percentage of dementia risk that is modifiable is higher than 40%. But we just don't have all the evidence yet.
So someone would not have had control over how much education they received in childhood?
Yeah, not later in life, no, but there is a lot of evidence that continuing to learn throughout middle age and later adulthood is also protective. So, for example, the more complex your occupation is, the lower the risk of dementia, because it keeps you cognitively and socially engaged to have a more complex job. And likewise, things like learning music and learning a second language later in life is protective. These things didn't make it into that Lancet model because the evidence isn't robust enough yet. But I think as we keep going and building that evidence base, we'll be able to add those kinds of factors in too.
Maybe what we can do is take each of the risk factors and look at them throughout the life of an individual. So if someone who is a senior today did not have the optimal exposure in terms of education and mental challenges in early years, maybe they were in a situation where their parents could not put them through university and they had a very limited education, and they're a senior today. How can that element of the mental capacity or the mental challenges that we give ourselves, how can a senior today take control of that to stave off dementia in their coming years?
Right. So, I picture it like a teeter-totter. So, for example, if somebody had not many opportunities for education earlier in life, that's increasing their risk a little bit of dementia. But we can do a whole bunch of other stuff to shift that scale or that teeter-totter. So they can stay cognitively engaged, say joining a book club, for example, or a discussion group. They can do all the other things that will help tip the scale the other way too. So staying physically active, If they have hearing impairments, that's also a big risk factor, one of the biggest ones, in fact. So getting their hearing tested and wearing hearing aids to help improve the information that's coming in so that they can be more cognitively engaged with that information. So all is not lost. I definitely don't ever want to give people that impression, because there's so many things that we can do to help reduce our risk.
So what about things like Sudoku, crossword puzzles?
What the evidence shows there is that it's a great way to stay cognitively engaged, but doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku is not going to generalize and make you better cognitively in every cognitive domain. You'll get better with crossword puzzles at retrieving words from your vocabulary, but it's not going to help you with, say, planning an event or remembering things that happen to you personally. So sure, go ahead and engage in those. I do Sudoku too, and enjoy word kind of games, but just as a way to keep me entertained when not much else is going on. But we can't expect it to be like a magic pill and improve our cognition globally.
But things such as the learning music, taking up a new language, as you say, reading widely and discussing that with others, those are more beneficial in terms of keeping the brain active and staving off or lowering our risk.
When you think about when we exercise, we try to get a whole body workout, right? So nobody would just lift a dumbbell with their right arm and do nothing else, right? That would just get your right arm strong, but it wouldn't do much for the rest of your body. And likewise, when we're trying to stay cognitively engaged, I encourage people to get a whole brain workout. So to do those verbal activities, that'll be more left hemisphere. I realize the camera's reversed. This is why I'm touching the left side of my head. So learning a new language or reading a book or being in a discussion group, that'll be a left hemisphere workout. You want to combine that with right hemisphere things like going out and exploring the city or doing puzzles or things like that. That's more spatial and more right hemispheric. And then finally, a frontal lobe workout. So planning events, organizing things, things like that are more problem-solving based will help work out your frontal lobe. So throughout your week or whatever, try to mix it up between verbal things, spatial things, and problem-solving activities so that you're working out all the important parts of your brain.
That gives a really good idea of, how we can organize our lives in our later years to ensure that we remain active, keep the brain active. There's also social. You had mentioned social activities, being in a book club. How much of a factor is that a risk factor that we can control? Isolation versus keeping engaged and social.
Right. There's no definitive number that I can give you about how much being social reduces risk. It does reduce it, but it also depends on the kind of social activity too. So there's having a social network, so that's all the different connections that you have. So if you picture like a big web, how many people are you really close with, how many acquaintances, things like that. So the size of the social network has been shown to be important. But even more important than that is what you get out of those social relationships. So if you have a sense of feeling connected to these people, then risk is even further reduced compared to maybe being a social gadfly but not connecting with any of those people very closely. Why does it help? Well, people deal with their health conditions better if they have social support. So maybe their friends encourage them to go out walking or something like that to help keep them healthier. Or they just feel that they can manage their health conditions better if they have the support of other people. It helps us cope with stress. By staying socially connected, it gives us a sense of purpose of us helping other people too. It's been shown to reduce depression, which is also a risk factor too. So helping people feel happier and better. But really the evidence is that the quality of our social connections matters more than the quantity of them.
That's an important point. Yes, it's the quality that makes the difference. So we've looked at keeping our brains active. We've looked at our social activity. You also mentioned physical activity. Shall we have a closer look at how we can take control of physical activity to reduce that as a risk factor for dementia?
Yeah, physical activity is probably one of the most important ones. That along with the hearing loss issue. But physical activity has definitely been shown to reduce dementia risk. And here we're talking primarily about aerobic activity, so getting your heart pumping. So research that has looked at this has taken sedentary older adults, enrolled them in exercise programs for like half a year, and looked at how well people do on cognitive tests before and after the program, looked at how healthy their brains were before and after the program. And what they've found is that people start to do better on tests of memory and problem solving, and their brains actually grow in size after just 6 months of exercise. And what's really neat about these studies is what the exercise was, because it wasn't anything too strenuous. It wasn't turning people into triathletes or anything like that, but it was just walking programs, getting people out 3 times a week, starting out at 10 minutes a day, because these were older adults who were quite unfit in the beginning, and gradually increasing up to an hour 3 times a week. So that's great news, that we don't have to do a lot to reap the benefits from exercise. It's just something that gets your heart pumping. If people have mobility issues, it could be even something with chair exercises or in a pool, for example, of even standing exercises in a pool. Just something that gets your heart pumping will have these benefits. And we know also now that physical aerobic exercise leads to the birth of new neurons too. So for many, many years, we thought that we were born with all the neurons we would ever have. We just start losing them from there. But we now know that we can actually grow new neurons. And the primary way that we can do that is when we're physically exercising. So it's really important to stay as fit as we possibly can.
Nicole, that is fascinating. That is truly fascinating. And you know, there's an old sort of attitude of, especially if someone is lifting weights, that it's all brawn, and there's this concept of brain versus brawn. But from what you're saying, that our physical activity is good for our brains.
Exactly.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. No brain without brawn.
Yes, yes. So one thing I wanted to look at a bit more closely is the hearing. Would you expand on that? How ensuring that our hearing, we have the highest level of hearing that we can maintain, how that can reduce the risk of dementia?
Yeah. So hearing loss is very common. It affects all of us. In fact, I'm thinking about going to get my hearing tested. I'm in my mid-50s, and I can definitely notice a change. And the idea behind it is that our brains function best when the quality of the information coming in is at its best. So, for example, my vision has also declined over the years, and without these glasses, I can't function. And if I were to try to do anything, take in any information, it wouldn't happen without these glasses on. And likewise, for people with hearing impairments, if they don't have their hearing aids in to help improve the quality of that signal, then they're just getting poor quality information in. And what older adults with hearing loss do too is they tend to socially isolate with time. They stop going to the restaurants because they're too noisy to hear what people are saying. They stop going to their clubs or to their churches or their synagogues or their mosques because they just can't hear what's going on. And so that's also reducing the amount of cognitive and social activity that they're engaged in. So now a lot of people will say, well, I don't like my hearing aids. They don't work. And to be honest, they're not perfect. The more you pay, the better ones you get, and I know that that's an issue too. But it's important to try to stick with it because our brain adapts to hearing aids and glasses. And it takes a while. It takes a few months. So I encourage people to get the best hearing aid that they can afford and to stick with it, because you just need your brain to learn how to use it, and then you'll reap the benefits from it.
Even though it may be a little uncomfortable at the start, stick with it, because the benefits go beyond just the hearing. It's a entire lifestyle and also our cognitive abilities long term. And what about diet? Shall we look at how diet can be a factor, a risk factor that we can take control of to prevent, the onset or push back the onset of dementia?
Yeah, for sure. So the Western style diet that most of us eat, which is high in red meat and saturated fats, is definitely bad for brain health. It's much better if people want to look to how to eat, they should look at the current Canadian food guide, because they got that spot on. It's really a brain health food guide. So this is a diet that's where people get most of their proteins through lean meats and fish, and not so much from the red meats, or from meat alternatives. A lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains are the key. So definitely look at the Canadian food guide. We also made a brain health food guide here at Baycrest, so they can Google Baycrest and then in their brain health food guide to look at that. That gives more like specific portions to target and foods to avoid as well. So the main way that diet influences brain health is through improving physical health. So it's improving our heart health and our whole body health, which I think we tend to, when we think about our health, we tend to think from the neck on down, and we forget that anything that's influencing our heart or our lungs or our muscles is also influencing our brain too. So if we're eating a poor diet that's clogging up our hearts, it's clogging up the brain vessels in our brain as well. So that's how diet influences brain health and reduces dementia risk.
And even seniors, I've heard it said that as you grow older, as you become a senior, you in fact need more protein. And I've heard seniors say that they have license to eat as much red meat as they want, because that's their protein, massive protein source. So a diet of a senior needing more protein, how do they balance that when thinking about controlling for dementia, the risk factor for dementia?
Yeah, I agree. They need more protein. They need to keep that muscle mass up so they don't become frail, for sure. So when we get older, we worry less about being overweight and more about being underweight, because that leads to frailty. And older adults who are frail are more likely to fall, break a hip, things like that too. So definitely older adults need protein, but they should be aiming to get it not from red meat, but from lean meats. So white meats, and from fish, and from nuts, and from tofu, and all the other things that give high levels of protein as well.
Can they really replace red meat in terms of giving, well, probably not the satisfaction, but the nutrients?
Yeah, I mean, I think with everything, when we make changes, at first it's hard, but after a while we get used to it, right? Like I used to drink a lot of pop in my childhood up through early adulthood. Now I have maybe one a year, and when I have it, I'm kind of like, ugh, why did I ever drink that regularly? So I with time, it's kind of like the hearing aids. If you stick with it, I think people will find that they adjust to their new lifestyle and they won't miss it so much.
And I can relate with what you're saying. I used to enjoy a good soda now and then I switched to fermented drinks. And now I can't take the carbonated drinks anymore. So you do adjust. You do adjust. Okay, so shall we turn to your own research? And what exactly are the questions your research is looking at? And what are some of the early indications? I understand there are three separate lines of inquiry you're following?
Well, more than three. There's a lot going on. I'd say that right now the main focus of my research is everything we've been talking about here today is about dementia prevention. And so we are gearing up. We're submitting a grant application in a couple of weeks, actually, based on some previous work that we did with a diet and exercise intervention. So this will, because of the pandemic, this will be a fully virtual intervention where people will meet in groups to do exercise and to discuss diet and how they can overcome barriers to help improve their diet. And we're also in that study looking at how the gut microbiome mediates changes of exercise or diet on cognition. So we know that there's a gut-brain axis, that the health of the bacteria in our gut influences how healthy our brains are. And definitely a diet very quickly can improve, a healthy diet can improve the health of your gut very rapidly. And exercise can also improve gut health as well. So are the changes that we see, the improvements in cognition from exercise or diet, partly responsible or caused by changes in the gut health? So that's one study that we're gearing up to do. We're also building here at Baycrest the Kimmel Family Center for Brain Health and Wellness, which is a research-based community center with a gym and a pool, a room for classrooms, floor exercises, an art room. And basically people will come in and get a dementia risk evaluation, looking at their genetics, their physical health, all the things that we talked about today. So are they exercising enough, eating well enough, etc. And then being prescribed personalized recipes or prescriptions to help reduce their risk of developing dementia. So that's very exciting to have this research-based community center that should open in the new year. And then I also do more fundamental work, just looking at how memory works and how it changes with healthy aging and with people who develop mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of a transitional stage between healthy aging and dementia. And I do some cognitive training studies as well.
Your research that's going to be virtual, how can someone participate? For instance, can seniors in Elliott Lake sign up once the program is started to be part of this?
Yeah, we'll be recruiting from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. So that's the beauty of virtual research, is it doesn't really matter where you are. We did restrict it to those 4 provinces just so that everybody's training at more or less the same time of day. Because we also, this is another interesting fact, that we have circadian rhythms. We cycle on about a 24-hour clock. And in general, most older adults are at their circadian peak in the morning, meaning they're most alert in the morning. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them are morning people. And so we want people to be engaging in these activities when they're at their peak, so in the morning. And so that's the only reason why we restricted it to those 4 provinces. So we once, knock on wood, the grant is funded and we start this in the new year, we'll have advertisements both on our website, but also we're partnering with a number of organizations across the 4 provinces to help spread the word about the study.
We at Diversity Canada would be happy to spread the word as well. So we look forward to keeping in touch with you on that. Yes. Okay. So that's great. And I'm excited to hear about the community center as well. That can indeed serve as a model for other community centers that seniors go to. Is that the intention?
Yeah, that is the long-term objective. So in general, Baycrest has a goal of developing the best programs possible, first here at home, but then helping to disseminate them and have other organizations both in Canada and around the world to adopt the practices. So that is our long-term goal, is to help people build similar centers wherever.
So we've been speaking about preventing dementia and how we can control risk factors. What about medicine or some sort of drug or some sort of treatment to completely eradicate the conditions that cause dementia? Is science getting us to that place? So how hopeful should we be that if it isn't there now, very soon we'll have beaten dementia by some sort of device or drug that science has come up with?
Yeah, so there are drugs in late-stage clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease specifically. And people might have heard that one of them was approved by the FDA very recently.
Controversially.
Very controversially. And I'm on the side thinking that they should not have approved it, to be honest. So what these drugs clearly do is they clear the amyloid, the protein that causes the plaques in Alzheimer's disease. They clear them out of the brain, which is fabulous that can be done now. But when I read the evidence from those trials, they didn't really have much benefit for cognition. And so my view, and I think the big pharma industry too is also moving in this direction, is that it's better to prevent than to try to cure dementia once it's set in. So once people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, their brain has already undergone about 20 years worth of buildup of pathology. And I think it's naive to think that at that point it can be cured. What I do think could happen is that these drugs, if given in people who are at risk of developing dementia, to stop it from building up in the disease from building up in the first place, I do think there's promise for that. And they are in fact moving, like they used to only do these trials in people with moderate and severe dementia. Then they started to do it in people with mild dementia. Now they're doing it in people with mild cognitive impairment before they even have dementia. And so they are taking more of a preventative approach. And so I think these drugs, combined with everything else that we talked about today, because I don't think the drugs alone will ever be the magic pill, to be literal, but combined with staying healthy, staying engaged, correcting your vision and your hearing and all these other things that we talked about, there I think we have a very good chance of significantly at least reducing the rates of dementia.
So don't depend on science. The message is don't depend on science.
Well, depend on science, but don't depend on magic pills.
Okay, yes. Don't depend on science to come up with something to fix the problem. Do whatever you can. Let the science guide you as to what you can do in your own control to reduce the risk of dementia. Yes. Okay, wonderful. So those were the areas that I had to cover. Is there anything that we have not touched on so far when discussing dementia and how to prevent it, how to live with it, perhaps, that you would like to expand on?
We didn't really get into the whole topic about living with dementia. That's kind of a separate issue.
How far into that area of living with dementia does your study go into? Is it more on the earlier side?
Yeah, the bulk of my research really is about healthy cognitive aging and how we can prevent dementia. I do a fair amount of work, as I mentioned, in people with mild cognitive impairment who are at high risk of developing dementia. But in terms of doing work with people with dementia, I've done a couple of things. One, we partnered with a company to do an artificial intelligence camera system to detect falls and notify the nursing staff right away if somebody had fallen. And it also captured a video so that the clinical team could look at it and see, well, why did this person fall? What can we do to reduce the risk of future falls? And then I also published a study looking at volunteer-led cognitive stimulation for people living with dementia in nursing homes compared to standard volunteer-friendly visits. And so volunteers were trained to do cognitive exercises with residents that helped to improve their verbal and visual memory and their verbal fluency too, which was pretty significant. And that study, I think, is important because the clinical staff don't have the time necessarily to have one-on-one cognitive activities. And volunteers can easily be trained to do this and to help keep residents living with dementia cognitively engaged.
That's a really important work that you have been doing on this very serious issue of dementia, one that affects a growing number of individuals and families. And I thank you for sharing all of the information that you've shared and spending the time to help us understand more about dementia and, more importantly, what we can do, what we can take control of to reduce the risk of dementia in our lives.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So indeed, it was a pleasure and a privilege to speak with Dr. Nicole Anderson, professor at the University of Toronto, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, to speak on dementia and how we can lower the risk of dementia by several means, by staying active physically, remaining engaged with others, ensuring we have a social network that's supportive, and many other tips. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Golden Years Fireside Chat series. I am Celia Sanker, Executive Director of the DiversityCanada Foundation, the organization that brings you the Golden Years Fireside Chat series, which can be found on goldenvoices.com. I hope that you've got lots that you can take away, actionable steps from this episode, and do join us for other episodes of the Golden Years Fireside Chat series. Until we meet again, take good care of yourself. Bye for now.